Welcome to the Eastern Crime Zone, the podcast that takes you inside investigations of real true crime cases. I'm your host, Cassie Millay, and each week I'll guide you through the twists and turns of some of the most fascinating cases in history. From the familiar to the obscure, we'll dive deep into the details and explore new angles you've never considered before. But I don't want this to be a one-sided conversation. I want to hear from you too. If there's a case that's been on your mind, head on over to easterncrimezone.com to leave me a voicemail, or slide into my DMs on Instagram at Eastern Crime Zone. Who knows? Your suggestion might just be featured on an upcoming episode. So sit back, grab your detective hat, and get ready for a journey through the criminal underworld. This is Eastern Crime Zone. Very quickly, before we get into today's case, I just want to say a big thank you to my sister Alex. She was my fairy godmother, honestly. She bought me this giant neon sign you see behind me if you're watching me on YouTube. And isn't she beautiful? It's exactly my logo. And it has Eastern Crime Zone, it has the magnifying glass with the thumbprint, and then it also has the question everything at the bottom. I love it so much. But not only that, she bought me this microphone and these headphones. So either way, if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on audio, she has improved the podcast. So fairy godmother, investor, best sister in the world, whatever you want to call her, big thank you to Alex. And unrelated to her buying me these things, it's coincidental that she's also going to be on the next episode of Eastern Crime Zone. She's going to be on to talk about a case from Australia. It's actually a cult case. She wanted me to find a cult, research it, and present her with the story. So we're actually going to record that tomorrow, and I'm very excited for y'all to hear about this one. So definitely don't miss next episode. It's going to be very, very interesting, and I can almost guarantee you've never heard of this case, because I love true crime, obviously, and I hadn't heard about this case until very recently. But let's go ahead and get into today's case. We're going to be talking about Corpsewood Manor and the very interesting people who inhabited it. Let's start with Dr. Charles Scudder. Dr. Charles Scudder was the son of Captain Charles Morrison Scudder and Eleanor Edith Lee. He was born in Wauwatosa, Milwaukee County, Wisconsin on October 6, 1926, which makes him a Libra. His father was a hydraulic and mechanical engineer and was the wealthiest man in their already wealthy neighborhood. Both of his parents were college educated and believed Charles and his sister Janet should follow in their footsteps. Charles grew up and studied zoology and languages at the University of Wisconsin. He had become a remarkably intelligent man with an interest in music, drama, math, and science. During this time, he met and married his first wife, Helen Kilbourne Hazlitt, who studied at Oberlin College. Unfortunately, this marriage didn't last very long and the two split up. In 1949, Charles finished his master's degree and met his second wife, Borgia Bunting. She was the daughter of poet Basil Bunting, but Borgia was impressive in her own right. She was an activist who opposed the death penalty and also served as the Assistant Attorney General in the state of Wisconsin. At this time, Charles listed his own occupation as an independent farmer in Wisconsin. The couple had 4 children together: Saul, Fenris Sorrow, Gideon, and Ahab, which are probably the most badass names I've heard in a very long time. Unfortunately, Ahab would pass away at only 17 years old, but his siblings Saul and Fenris went on to become working professionals, just like their parents, and Gideon would win the lottery twice. After Ahab's death, Charles began looking into countercultural ideas. Charles and Borgia would split in the 1950s, and Charles moved to Chicago because he had an art piece called The Mechanoid 2 in an art exhibition. And by 1959, Charles began teaching biology at the University of Illinois. Charles also enrolled at the Stritch Medical School of Loyola University and received a PhD in pharmacology in 1964. This degree opened a door for Charles to work as an assistant director of Stritch's Institute for the Study of Mind, Drugs, and Behavior. In this position, he worked on government-funded experiments with LSD. At this time, the United States was hoping to use LSD to control people's minds during interrogations. They were hoping that mind-altering drugs like LSD would work as sort of truth serum and force confessions. This program was known as MK Ultra. That could be a whole episode in of itself, but I found it really interesting that Charles may have been involved with this program. One of Charles's teachers described his former student, friend, and colleague as being quite eccentric. Charles kept a pet monkey and would dye his hair odd colors, which at the time was even more strange. When I had fun color hair, I had split dye hair, so it was half black, half red on one side, and I would change the red side to blue and purple, and people looked at me like I was crazy. But that was in 2020. I can't even imagine back then what people would have thought about his blue and purple hair that I kept reading about. He bought a mansion on West Adams Street in Chicago and filled it with Baroque furniture he purchased from feeders. In the garden, there was a pink gargoyle that squirted water from its mouth into a fountain. So, we can obviously say Charles is a very unique individual. He was also an accomplished harp player and had been invited to play with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He also had a golden harp at his house.
When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?
Shortly after moving to Chicago, Charles met Joey Odom. Joey was born on March 27, 1938, in Cook County, Illinois. Joey's upbringing was different from Charles. His father only had a second-grade education and worked as a hotel linen boy 52 hours per week. In a year, he would make $853, which is less than a quarter of what Charles' father made growing up. His mother helped out where she could cleaning homes, but this didn't bring in very much money to the household. Like both of his parents, Joey did not finish his education and dropped out in the 5th grade. Joey's talent was in the kitchen cooking amazing meals Charles would later describe as fit for a king. He preferred to cook with iron skillets on a simple wood stove. Joey would move into Charles's mansion and serve as a housekeeper and cook for Charles. But their relationship quickly turned romantic, and Charles attempted to disinherit his own children in his will to leave everything to Joey if he passed away. The couple was not open with their relationship, and everyone around the couple thought that Joey was just the hired help. The couple got 2 huge mastiffs named Beelzebub and Arsarath. I may be pronouncing the second dog's name wrong, but Beelzebub is a demon, and Arsarath is a character from H.P. Lovecraft. After a while in Chicago, Charles began to dream of a simpler life for himself and Joey. I mean, who doesn't? You go to work every day, you come home, there's drama, there's chaos. Just the hustle and bustle of everyday life was really starting to get to him. After Charles's mother passed away, he received a small inheritance that would pay him out $100 per month in addition to his own retirement account that would pay him $111 per month. This was enough for the couple to start looking for a new place to live away from the chaotic city life. In 1975, Charles purchased 40 acres in the middle of the Chattahoochee National Forest in Treon, Georgia, for $10,500. Allegedly, the land was so cheap because several of the previous owner's family members had died from rattlesnake bites, but there's no evidence that this actually happened, only legend. Charles resigned from his job on his 50th birthday, but managed to take 3 vials of LSD and 2 human skulls with him when he quit. These 3 vials equaled 12,000 doses of government-grade LSD-25. I don't know why he needed so much LSD. That seems like overkill to me, but go off, I guess. Charles auctioned off the majority of his possessions, and the couple took their 2 dogs to begin their off-grid life. After the long drive from Illinois to Georgia, getting lost, sleeping in the car, Joey and Charles found their new home, and a rotting horse carcass right in the road leading up to it, near a graveyard. But they didn't let this get them down. They decided to take it in stride and name the road Dead Horse Road and their new home Corpsewood Manor. They didn't let this get them down. They took it in stride, and because of it, they named the road Dead Horse Road and their home Corpsewood Manor. There were no buildings on this property at the time, so they began building it themselves. Charles did most of the work as Joey had previously been in a car accident and injured his leg. Their home took a long time to build, just the 2 of them, but it was very unique and personalized to the couple. During the construction of the house, 45,000 bricks were laid by hand, 3 layers thick with 2-inch wide airspace between the layers for insulation. They dug trenches and installed pipes for sinks, a tile drainage system, and a chemical toilet, which was later enclosed in a brick outhouse. There would be no plumbing or electricity to the house, just like they wanted. They would get their water out of a well and live off the grid. The house was very gothic, with skulls, the pink gargoyle from the Chicago house, and very interesting paintings. Being the eccentric that he was, Charles was interested in the occult, having decorated Corpsewood Manor in satanic artifacts and other occult items. He drove around with a pentagram painted on the side of his Jeep, actually. Despite this, Charles never identified as a Satanist, instead was an atheist who related to the belief system of Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan and the religion of LaVeyan Satanism. As practiced by the Church of Satan, they actually don't worship the Christian version of Satan or the devil, but instead worship oneself, and the devil is more of a symbol for humankind's inner desires. The way I understand the Church of Satan is that using Satan is almost a parody of other religions. It's kind of mocking other religions in a way because they don't believe in any sort of deity. It's more representative of pleasing yourself as long as you're not hurting someone else. A few months before today's case took place, Charles had painted a self-portrait bound with duct tape over his mouth and what looked like 5 bullet holes in his head, which many speculate was a premonition of his own death. A friend of the couple, Candace Williamson, confirmed that Charles said it was a self-portrait, and another friend of the couple, Tracy Wilson, said that Charles had told her about the painting, saying, "That's how I'm going to die." The main house on the property was only for Charles and Joey, but they did have several outbuildings, including a chicken coop. The chicken coop was 3 different levels, and on the first level of the chicken coop was for poultry and food storage. The second floor was for canned goods, and the top floor was nicknamed the Pink Room, furnished with mattresses and pink linens where the couple would entertain guests. Notably, the home was built with curved walls, which legend said protects residents from evil because there are no corners to hide in. The Pink Room would also be known as a pleasure chamber and contained sex paraphernalia like whips, chains, and lots of porn. One of the most talked about parts of the Pink Room is the guest book, where their sexual partners would sign in and write their sexual preferences. So it's safe to say the couple had a lot of company in the Pink Room to warrant a whole guest book. Unfortunately, there aren't any pictures of the Pink Room or the guest book available anywhere. Former Sheriff Gary McConnell said that the guest book was put into evidence and then disappeared. I think this makes a lot of sense, especially if someone involved in the legal process after this case maybe was on that list and didn't want to expose that they had gone to the Pink Room with these 2 men. Obviously, Charles and Joey were not a monogamous couple, and some would speculate that they may not have been together. In my opinion, I think they were very much a couple, especially because Charles had tried to leave all of his worldly possessions to Joey in his will. They lived together, they made joint decisions, they had sex together. To me, that's a couple. They may not have been monogamous or very affectionate in front of others, but I do think that they were a couple. Together, they would often throw sex and game parties where participants would enjoy some of that LSD and homemade wine and have sex together. The men quickly earned reputation as the new-to-town strangers who dressed like hippies and drove a black Jeep with a pentagram painted on the side. Curious residents started making the drive up the Mountain View Road to investigate their strange new neighbors. At the entrance to Corpsewood property, a wooden sign greeted them with a warning, "Beware of the Thing," which was likely an Addams Family reference. Some townspeople didn't really get the Addams Family reference and thought that this was evidence that Charles had summoned a demon to guard the property. Other rumors would get started, like having seen robed figures holding seances in the woods. There were a lot of cultural forces fueling the local gossip. By 1982, Charles and Joey had been in Georgia for 5 years, and the satanic panic was full force, not just in Chattooga County. Pop culture was preoccupied by the devil and the occult. Less than a decade before, The Exorcist horrified moviegoers with scenes of levitation, projectile vomiting, and vertebrae-cracking neck spins. Fantasy role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons debuted in 1974, scandalizing pastors and giving parents nightmares of their children falling under demonic spells. As word got around about the 2 devil worshippers who lived in a castle with no utilities in the middle of the woods, curious locals came to visit. One witness described if an unknown guest dropped by at night, rather than saying, "Who are you?" as most would, Charles would call out, "Who am I?" And if the visitor knew him by name, they were welcomed in. Despite the fact that their intention was to live under the radar in their new community, they did develop relationships and friendships with a few locals. One of their closest friends was Candace Williamson. She was a frequent visitor to the manor. On pretty days, she, Joey, Charles, and her children would sit outside at a picnic table in the back, enjoying the surroundings. Candace's daughter, Carrie Hamilton, remembers Corpsewood as an almost magical place. The colors and scents surrounding the house were so vivid they remained etched in her memory to this day. And so do the flavors of the blackberry dessert Joey would make and the sound of Charles playing his beloved harp. Local hunters regularly passed through their property and would ask them for permission to hunt on their land, many of which enjoyed their hospitality and homemade wine. One of these hunters was Kenneth Avery Brock, but he went by his middle name, Avery. In 1982, Avery was only 17 years old, and he had not had an easy life since his father had kicked him out of the family home. He now lived with a roommate, 30-year-old felon Samuel Tony West, known as Tony. Avery at this point had begun to steal to feed himself, most likely following in his new roommate's footsteps. Avery had been hunting in the forest near Corpsewood when he met Charles and Joey. He had heard stories about the gay devil worshippers living in the mountains, but he wasn't afraid of them. He was intrigued. Upon invitation, he visited the manor and the Pink Room. The strong homemade muscadine wine removed Avery's inhibitions, and Charles decided to perform sexual acts with him. At the time, the age of consent in Georgia was 14 years old. However, sodomy was still illegal, even among married couples. Regardless, Avery visited the Pink Room for entertainment on more than one occasion. I don't want to understate how gross I think it is that Joey and Charles were okay with inviting a 17-year-old teenager into the Pink Room for adult activities. I think that's really gross, and they should have known better than to take advantage of a young person, especially to supply them with alcohol as well. It adds a different layer to this case that I don't hear people often talk about. Most true crime stories only tell the positive side that favors the victim, but it's not always the truth. Charles was over 50 years old, so he should have never invited Avery up to the Pink Room in the first place. It doesn't make what happens in today's case correct or right by any means, but Avery should have never been there. Tony hadn't had an easy life either. His father died in a train accident when he was only 10 years old. According to his sister Myra, Tony was never the same. When he was only 13, he shot and killed his 2-year-old nephew in the head. At the time, Tony claimed that this was an accident because he found the gun in the house and was playing with it, and he had no idea it was loaded. Later at the trial, Tony would claim to have received psychiatric help 50 or 60 times in his life. On one occasion while serving time for theft, Tony escaped jail and shot his own brother-in-law. By the time of our case, Tony was 30, unemployed with no prospects. Avery came home one day and told Tony about Charles and Joey. Tony was always interested in free drugs and alcohol, so Avery took him to Corpsewood Manor one night. During this visit, Tony saw Avery engage in some sexual acts with Charles and decided to leave as he didn't believe in homosexuality. On this occasion, Tony also alleges that Charles wanted to engage with sexual acts with him as well. Later, when the roommates got to talking, Tony and Avery suspected that Charles and Joey were wealthy and hiding their riches in the main house. They did live in a mansion on a large piece of property, and Charles obviously was very well educated. They assumed that they had a lot of money. In the privacy of their shared trailer, Tony and Avery began devising a scheme to ambush and rob them. The two believed that Charles must keep his money in cash inside the main house on the property. They believed that since Charles and Joey lived off the grid, that they must not trust banks. Avery went back to Corpsewood with the intention on going into the main house and scouting for valuables. But when he asked to visit the main house, Charles said absolutely not. The main area of their home was not for guests. What Tony and Avery didn't account for was that Charles kept the $40,000 he had left from his pension and his mother's inheritance in a savings account. There was no cash inside Corpsewood Manor at all, and they would only receive $200 per month as part of their budget. Actually, in an article Charles wrote and published a year prior, he said the intent of their move to Treon was to get back to basics, be poor. On Sunday, December 12, 1982, Tony and Avery put their plan into action. Avery asked his mother to borrow her .22 caliber rifle for rabbit hunting before the two went to Tony's sister's house to watch some football. At the house was Tony's nephew, 19-year-old Joey Wells. For simplicity, since we already have a Joey in today's case, we'll call him Wells for the rest of the episode. On this particular day, Wells had met and asked Teresa Hudgens out on a date. Avery and Tony thought it'd be a good idea for some reason to bring Wells and his date Teresa along to Corpsewood with them for their robbery. Avery would later claim that Wells had been in on the plan from the beginning, but Wells always denied this. All involved agree, however, that Teresa had no idea what was going to happen that night, and she just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The four hopped into Tony's Javelin and headed out, stopping once at the Red Barn convenience store for $1 worth of gas and cigarettes. At this point, they told Teresa they were going on top of the mountain to the devil worshipper's house. Obviously, this freaked her out, but Avery calmed her fears, saying it was just a couple of gay men who made homemade muscadine wine. On the ride up to Corpsewood, everyone in the car started huffing a mix of paint thinner, glue, and alcohol they called Toodaloo. Apparently, Toodaloo is similar to cocaine, but a lot cheaper to make. When they arrived, Charles greeted them and invited them up to the pink room where they always entertained their guests. Charles started talking to Wells and Teresa as he had never met the teens before. Avery then left the room under the pretense of grabbing more Toodaloo. He got the rifle from the car and came back to the pink room. When Charles saw the rifle, he simply laughed and said, "Bang, bang." It's thought that this may have been an attempt from Charles to defuse the situation, as he had done with plenty of locals who had come up to Corpsewood to cause trouble with him. It worked for a little bit, though. Avery laid down the gun and sat laughing with the others for the next 20 minutes. When Charles stood back up, Avery changed his tune. Avery then put a knife to Charles's throat. Charles, probably pretending, laughed and asked what game Avery wanted to play. Avery threw Charles to the mattress on the floor and tied his hands behind his back with strips of sheets that he had cut up. Avery then demanded to know where the money was. Charles told him honestly that there was no money. At this point, Teresa was rightfully freaking out. She had no idea what was going on, and she barely knew any of the men she was with and was under the influence. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pleaded, "Don't hurt nobody. Let us go." Charles managed to ask before he was gagged if she was all right, and her response was, "You'd better worry about yourself." At this point, Teresa and Wells escaped down the ladder from the chicken coop, and Tony came after them with the gun, telling them to come back. By this point, Wells had discovered that Tony's javelin wouldn't start, so they followed Tony back up to the pink room. During all of this, Joey was in the kitchen in the main house, unaware of any of the evil that had come to his home. Avery took the gun from Tony and decided to interrogate Joey about where the money was, since he couldn't get any information from Charles. The four remaining in the chicken house heard bullets before Avery returned to announce that he had killed Joey and the two mastiffs. Tony and Avery then dragged Charles down the ladder to the kitchen in the main house. There he saw his partner laying dead in their home in a pool of blood. Joey Odom had died from bullets to the head and one stray bullet in his arm. The dogs lay dead near the heater. Likely the dogs didn't have enough time to even get up to try to protect their owners, as Avery had shot each of them in quick succession. At this point, they took the gag out of Charles's mouth and asked him for a soldering iron, most likely to torture answers out of him. A soldering iron, if you don't know, is a tool with a metal tip that gets really, really hot. We're talking 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is used primarily to bind metal together. Charles told them that since they have no electricity, they wouldn't have a soldering iron. Thank God, because I don't want to know what they would have done if they would have had that tool to use on Charles. With his feet still bound, Charles made his way over to Joey's body. Tony shouted at him to stop or he would shoot Charles on the spot. He cried out, "I asked for this." And this comment has always been speculated about. Why did Charles say he asked for this? Did he mean their lifestyle of inviting strangers into the home? Did he mean his self-portrait he had painted months before with him bound with bullet holes? Or did he mean inviting some kind of spirit into their home with seances people claim to have seen on the property? I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this because I have no idea why he would have blamed himself for this situation. The only people's fault it is Avery and Tony. As Charles continued towards Joey's body, Tony shot Charles in the face. The first shot brought him to his knees, and the next 3 shots to the head finished the job. Charles was dead. Avery was getting excited about how much money they must be about to get. He and Tony searched the house, tossing items around in search of cash that wasn't even there. They found some coins, a little jewelry, a leather jacket, handcuffs, and a few other small objects to take with them. During their search, however, They missed the 3 vials of LSD, which were probably the most expensive items in the home. Before they left, they shot Joey's and Charles each one more time. Charles now had 5 bullets in his head, just like his health portrait had predicted. Avery left the scene in the victim's Jeep while Tony got his own car to start, and he put Wells and Teresa in the back and left with them. Tony threatened the teenagers to never tell anyone what they had witnessed. He told them that he and Avery were going to leave for the Philippines, which was a bold-faced lie, as they never even intended to go to the Philippines. Wells later told Teresa they couldn't call the police because he wouldn't want to get his uncle in trouble. Wells and his mother Myra would keep Teresa there for 4 days without access to a phone before she was able to get in contact with her own family. Tony sold Wells his car for $7 and headed west in the stolen Jeep with Avery. Avery and Wells were actually thinking about heading to Mexico when they stopped to sleep at a rest stop in Vicksburg, Mississippi. They had already been thinking about ditching the Jeep for a different car when they saw Lieutenant Kirby Key Phelps sleeping alone in his Toyota. They woke the sleeping man, who was terrified, saying, "Take anything you want. Just don't shoot me." Avery began moving their things into the Toyota from the Jeep while Tony took Kirby into the woods. Kirby got loose and threw a punch at Tony. In response, Tony shot the man 3 times in the head and searched his body for his wallet. Back in Georgia, 4 days passed before anyone knew that anything had gone wrong at Corpsewood Manor. A friend of Charles and Joey, Raymond Williams, stopped by for a visit. He had actually been to the house the day before, but left when he saw that his friend's Jeep wasn't there. He assumed that they had went into town for supplies, as they usually did once a month. On this day, however, he decided he was going to look around and see what was going on. Joey and Charles almost never left the property, but especially not 2 days in a row. The door was left open, and Raymond quickly discovered the gruesome crime scene and raced into town to notify the police. Deputies from the Chattooga County Sheriff's Office were at Corpsewood within the hour. Upon entering the house, they found blood-stained walls, overturned furniture, and bullet casings. Sheriff Gary McConnell called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or the GBI, and the State Crime Lab. Corpsewood Manor was under siege again, but this time from police and forensic investigators. The Jeep was found the same day as the bodies in Louisiana, where Avery had dumped it. The crime scene was a lot for investigators to take in. The bodies had been decaying in the house for 4 days, which would smell bad enough, but the home and its occupants were not very hygienic either. There was no running water at the house, so neither Joey or Charles bathed very often, and they didn't clean the home well either. Investigators said it was the worst-smelling crime scene they had ever been at. Not only the smell, but the house itself was pretty off-putting. They had satanic art, whips, chains, porn, and real human skulls scattered around the place. It was at the very least unsettling. On December 16th, Teresa finally got away from Wells and his mother and called the sheriff right away. Sheriff McConnell spoke to Teresa, then Wells, for several hours. GBI agents retrieved the rifle from Avery's mother. At 2:30 a.m., December 17th, warrants were issued for Avery and Tony. By Saturday, Tony and Avery were not getting along anymore. They were in Texas at this point and arguing about everything under the sun. Finally, Avery hitchhiked back home to Georgia, where he was arrested. Upon his arrest, Avery confessed and informed officers about their other victim, Lieutenant Kirby Phelps, who they identified with his Navy identification card. Tony made it to Missouri before deciding to reverse course and head back east. On Christmas Eve, passing through Chattanooga, Tennessee, he ran out of gas. Penniless and exhausted, he walked through the rain to the Palomino Club Lounge, where he found an off-duty officer, Officer Gene Haas. And there he confessed his crimes. Officer Haas didn't see any warrants for Tony since they were in a different state. So he took Tony and they drove over the state line to Georgia to confirm if he had a warrant out for murder, but officers were concerned about the legality of an officer from a different state bringing Tony in, so they made the officer go back over the state line with Tony so Tony could walk himself back into the state of Georgia and be arrested. Just seems like a lot of unnecessary steps, but that's our justice system for you. During the trial of Tony and Avery, Charles was accused of spiking the wine with LSD in order to try to have oral sex with them. When tested by police, the wine bottle did not have any trace of LSD. Tony tried to use the defense of involuntary intoxication. The defense attorney went as far to say in the matter of the supposed drugging, he had motive because he was homosexual. The jury ignored this prejudicial line of questioning. Tony himself had confessed to a GBI agent that he and Avery had planned the murders and robbery days before the killings. Tony also told the GBI agent that Avery wanted to kill Charles because Charles had engaged in oral sex with the 17-year-old. During the trial, Dr. Kazmar was contacted for an interview. This was a colleague and supervisor of Dr. Charles Scudder back at the university. In the interview, Kazmar testified that Charles was not a drug abuser or a devil worshiper, and that he was dependable. He also said that to his knowledge, Charles never did any research on LSD, and that he seemed like the type to disapprove of drug use. Which I don't believe at all, because he stole LSD from the college he worked at, so how would he have not worked with LSD? And if he was the type of person who really did disapprove of drug use, he would not have stolen it and brought it into his home. There was a small private funeral service held at Corpsewood Manor for Dr. Charles Scudder and Joseph. Joey's ashes were scattered in the rose garden near Corpsewood Manor. Charles's ashes were taken back to Wisconsin by his sister and buried in the family plot on April 25, 1983. By 1986, Charles' gold-encrusted heart fell into the hands of famed defense attorney Bobby Lee Cook. Cook had been hired by Dr. Scudder's 4 sons to represent their claim to the estate. Joey's sister also claimed the estate since Charles' will left everything to Joey. The property was purchased soon after the murders, however, and stories began to circulate about the home's unusual homestead even before the fire. Stories began to circulate about the couple's unusual homestead even before a fire destroyed most of the non-brick portion of the buildings. People have said the property is haunted. Visitors have reported hearing sounds of gunshots, dogs barking, or the sound of a harp playing. You can visit Corpsewood Manor, although most of it is just rubble at this point. Unfortunately, that is all I have for you on today's case. You'll have to let me know what you think of today's case. I'm especially interested to know what you think about Charles saying, "I asked for this," before he was murdered. I also want to know what you think about his self-portrait with the 5 gunshots. It's really, really eerie, and I can't come up with a logical reason why that would have happened. 5 months before he was murdered in that exact way, he painted that. Sometimes the truth is really stranger than fiction. So you'll have to let me know what you think. Again, next week we will be back with a different case out of Australia. It's going to be a cult case, which are always very fascinating. But until I see you next week for the next case, please like and subscribe, do all the things that podcasters and YouTubers say to do at the end of their videos so we can keep sharing this kind of content with others. Stay safe, be kind, and remember to question everything. Bye.